Welcome to M-05.Paradigm. I am Jeevan Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of Public Policy, Law and Governance, Central University of Rajasthan. Today we are going to learn about a paradigm shift from government to governance in a course, Public Administration and Introduction. The objectives of today's lecture is to understand the concept of governance and its meaning. And we will also find out the reasons for the emergence of the concept of governance and the factors that enable for that, and also see how India has responded to the emergence of the concept of governance and identify the issues that are emerging in the evolution. When we understand the concept of the governance, we should be in a position to understand what is the role of the state in terms of its service delivery to the citizens. So the role of state is closely linked with the concept of governance, because the concept of governance has redefined the role of the state. And the evolution of the concept has brought a lot of changes in the administrative systems across the world, because with the advent of globalization and neoliberal policies, governance has become an important concept to be studied in the field of public administration. Further, liberalization, globalization, and privatization has transformed the way in which administrative systems respond in delivering services to the citizens. Besides, reinventing government in 1980s and new public management has had its own impact in restructuring the relationship between the state, market, and civil society. So all these factors put together have brought a change in the manner in which government is functioning. And if we further go into the details of the concept of governance, that in the post-World War II, the role of the state has increased in many parts of the world. And it has been argued that the state should play an important role starting from the birth of a citizen to the death. So that's how we see that the role of state is to take care of citizens from womb to tomb. And we also see that the concept of governance has brought a lot of changes in the political institutions, where the monopoly of the political institutions have been questioned, because the role of the state has been considered to be minimal. So the concept of governance argues for the minimal role for the state. And as I have discussed, we also see that governance also involves a role for the private sector and market and the civil society in the decision-making process. And if you look at some of the major definitions given by the scholars, Jerry Stoker says that the role of public sector and private sector has been blurred in terms of service delivery. That is how we can understand that the concept of governance emphasizes that the public and private sectors go together in delivering services. Prior to that, the role of the public sector was very dominant because it was playing a monopolistic role. And then you also see that in the decision-making process, only the public sector and government officials have been involved. But with the emergence of the concept of governance, now we see a new actors are coming into that. So the monopoly of the public sector can no longer be valid, as the concept of governance emphasizes. And governance also can be understood as networks, because governance is a network between state, market, and civil society. And this network as a policy network is the substance of entire concept of governance. Let us spend some time on what this governance as a policy networks. As I have discussed, governance is a network between state, market and civil society. We can see these relationships at two levels. One is at formal level, the other one is at informal level. At a formal level, the state has to interact with business and market and civil society. And there is also another level at which the state interacts with non-state sectors, for example, the NGOs. And we also can understand governance at the implementation level also and operation level also. So the concept of governance as a policy networks assumes that these networks are necessary to get service delivery done, which was earlier dominated by the public sector alone. When we understand the concept of the governance, we also need to link it to the democracy. And in the discourse on governance, we see that governance is the one which enhances the economic liberalism and side by side the democracy. And in the process, what happened is good governance is equated with democracy and economic liberalism, while bad governance is seen as the more intervention of the state. So the concept of a governance has redefined the notions of the functioning of the government as such. So good governance seeks minimal role for the state in terms of its service delivery, and the gap that is left by the public sector will be filled with the non-state sectors like NGOs and business. This is the concept of governance and its meaning. Here again, we have to see the notions of governance vis-a-vis civil society. What is a civil society? The civil society is equated with the freedom and liberties of individuals, while the state seems to be oppressive in its nature. So there was an increasingly argument that civil society can do everything and what the state cannot do. And the civil society is equated with the idea of the liberalization, while the state is equated with the more interventionist and more oppressive in that. So the more the presence of the civil society, the more the scope for the democracy. That is how we see that the governance is also about strengthening democracy and strengthening the civil society. And we can see that governance is about restructuring the relationship between state, civil society and market. That is how the governance reforms have become very popular throughout the world, starting from Africa, Latin America and the other developing countries. So this is how the concept of governance has come into work in the literature of public administration and public policies. Let us now discuss how governance views partnership as a strategy. What are these partnerships all about? These partnerships are all about the public and private partnership, which were not earlier. These partnerships marked a shift in the manner in which government delivers services. Earlier, the public sector was dominated by the bureaucrats who take decisions. But now, when we see the concept of governance as a strategy of partnership, now there is a scope for the other non-state sectors. For instance, In India, after globalization, the government of India has to invite the business sector and the civil society groups to take part in the policy formulation. And this itself is a watershed in the development of Indian history. And with this, the bureaucratic dominance has come down, where the civil society engages in the discussions and debate in policy formulation. For example, the right to information is the culmination of the efforts made by the civil society organization MKSS in Rajasthan, which fought for the right to information. At business level, we also see the FICCI and Confederation of Indian Industry, who are invited to take part in the decisions taken at the central level. So we see here that the partnership has emerged as a strategy of good governance. This linking with the non-state sectors was not existent earlier times. Thereby, the notion of governance questioned the hierarchy of the public sector. And these partnerships have allowed the government to learn from the non-state sector also. Dear students, so far we have learnt about the concept of governance and its evolution and its meaning. And it is pertinent also to look at the factors for the emergence of the concept of governance. As I discussed earlier, that in the post-World War II, Second World War II, we see that the state's role has been redefined in terms of socio and economic development. And the scholars were criticizing the performance of the state and its apparatus in terms of looking after the welfare of its citizens. And it has been argued that state alone is not able to cater to the needs of the citizens, and it is unable to cater to the needs of the contemporary society. Therefore, the ineffectiveness of the state and its apparatus has become evident. This is one of the important factors for the emergence of governance. And the state's inability to formulate policies effectively and its ability to implement is also becoming conspicuous in the post-World War II period. And the questions are raised about the efficacy of policy formulation and policy implementation by the state, and the bureaucracy has paved the way for the emergence of the concept from government to governance. There is also an argument that state is not transparent, state is also not accountable to the citizens, which also gave rise to the concept of governance as such. Besides, the waves of globalization that swept across the world in OECD countries placed more role on the market, more role on the non-state actors. So the more argument was in favor of freeing the economy and liberalizing the economy, reducing the scope for the state and its discretion, allowing the market to play its own role to have economic growth. And the neoliberal reforms that were introduced in India in early 1990s is a witness to this paradigm shift from government to governance. So far, we try to understand the meaning of governance and its evolution and the factors contributed to the emergence of that concept. Now we will look at some of the efforts made by Indian government vis-a-vis these developments. As I have discussed earlier, governance is about new style of functioning. The government of India adopted in its policies and policy documents subsequently. These are to do with the neoliberal economic reforms that were introduced in 1991. And this agenda of governance in Indian context is also about reforming the administration and redefining the role of the state. What does it mean? The role of the bureaucracy to cater to the changing needs of the society needs to be enhanced. Therefore, there was a scope for introducing governance reforms in bureaucracy. We see the efforts in terms of appointing the Second Administrative Reforms Commission in 2005. And we also see that these governance reforms is very wide and they cut across economic aspects and political aspects and administrative aspects. In other words, governance reforms will have a bearing on both policy formulation and policy implementations. To put it in concrete terms, governance reforms will have a bearing on the delivery of goods and services because they altered the notion of service delivery at micro level. And subsequently, the governance reforms emphasized the more economic growth in those countries. And governance reforms were introduced in the developing countries, particularly in Africa and the Latin America, and which were even introduced in India also. And governance reforms were seen as a neoliberal reforms in terms of enhancing investment in the countries. There was a felt need by the government of India to raise the level of investment, and the government was not having enough resources to raise the investment. And it felt that it should involve the private sector in funding the projects in infrastructure, power, and social sector also. The heavy investment need from private sector brought a lot of changes in the manner in which public sector projects were undertaken subsequently. We also see that these changes have been reflected in the policy documents also. For instance, 11th Five-Year Plan emphasized on public-private partnership, which was an innovative way of implementing mechanism. What is this public-private partnership? Public-private partnership is about designing, funding, and implementing projects with the help of private sector. And this public-private partnerships, known as PPPs, is innovative mechanism to deliver services. And we also see that the 11th Five-Year Plan envisaged more role for the private sector in augmenting the resources to undertake public sector projects. And it was envisaged in the policy document that the investment from 20 crores during 11th Five-Year Plan must be increased to 40 crores in the 12th Five-Year Plan. All these developments indicate what? They indicate that the private sector's interference and its role is inevitable in public service delivery. It also questions the monopoly of the public sector in service delivery. And that is how the public sector has to partner with private sector in delivering services. And the comments given by the political leadership indicate that the public-private partnership is a mode of service delivery and which is seen as an innovative. And we will also see in terms of business, these partnerships are also done with the business people. For instance, Prime Minister, he headed a council of trade and industry where he put a lot of, for the first time, the industries on the board, involving them to participate in the policy formulation. This was not existent earlier, where India was dominated by the technocratic bureaucrats in 1950s. Therefore, the business organizations like FICCI and CII were representing in policy formulation, and it gave an opportunity for them to articulate their interests. The government also had to take the support of these business organizations with an aim to enhance economic growth in the countries. This is one of an important development in economic domain and economic governance. We will also see the efforts of government of India in terms of social sector. And the Ministry of Human Resource Development also followed the suit of involving the non-state actors in policy making. The best example that we see is the Right to Information Act in 2005, which was a culmination of the participation of MKSS in the policy formulation. That is how we see the presence of the civil society organizations in policy formulation. And we can also see the involvement of non-state actors at two levels. One is at social movement, the other is at NGO level. And this NGO level, we see that they participate in the implementation of public policy at the micro level. And the government of India also involved the civil society groups in policy formulation, whereby it formed a council called National Advisory Council. Though it was not a constitutional body, but it played an important role in formulating the policies in association with these civil society groups. These developments were envisaged by the 8th five-year plan, where it sought for the role of the non-state actors in policy making. Dear students, so far we have seen the meaning of governance and the factors contributed to the evolution of that concept, and policy as networks with market and civil society. We also have seen how public-private partnerships have emerged as a new way of implementing mechanism. And now we will see also the achievements of these networks under the concept of governance. As policy document reflected these shifts, and a lot of projects were undertaken in health, education, and infrastructure. And what is the outcome of these initiatives? The studies show that the implementation of PPPs in health and education is having a positive effect compared to the projects in road. The studies show that the implementation of public public-private partnerships has a mixed results. For instance, a joint House Committee of Karnataka probed that and it indicted the officials at the Bengaluru airport for the faulty design and implementation. And there were also reports that the public-private partnerships were having a defect because the private sectors were reaping more profit out of these projects, and which goes against the spirit of the public and private partnerships. And as I have discussed earlier, in terms of providing health and education, public-private partnerships are doing better. For instance, initiatives in Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan and clearly indicate that the implementation of public sector projects with NGOs will lead to success. And what were the challenges that were faced with all these developments? The challenges that were faced in the development calls for attention of the students of public administration. Well, the concept of governance has redefined the relationship between the state, market and civil society. Is everything good with this kind of developments? What is the role of the state in terms of its accountability? Is the state transparent? Is the private sector that is involved in service delivery transparent? These were some of the questions that were raised by the scholars. Yes, network governance has sought the role for civil society and the market. Is it conducive to the Indian model or Indian development? These are some of the questions. Let us examine some of the challenges that were faced in the background of the governance reforms. There was an argument that the state tries to evade the responsibility by undertaking the public-private partnerships, and it was a major criticism against the state. It was also seen that the bureaucrats will try to forge relationship with the business in the garb of public-private partnerships. And it was also criticized that state is taking a back step in providing services to the citizens, therefore neglecting the welfare. And the possibility of developing a nexus between society, business and governance was seen in a negative manner. It saw that state is losing its sovereignty, states is losing its dominance. Are these claims true? We need to think about these developments. Though the concept of governance has envisaged a role for the business and civil society groups, the role of the state remains valid. State cannot give its sovereignty to the non-state sector because the state derives its legitimacy from the citizens. State needs to coordinate all these relationships. Therefore, the claim that governance has reduced the scope for the state is not completely valid. We see that the role of the state has diminished to the extent that it is given to the non-state sector, and the state's role remains valid. State is not dead. We summarize what we have seen in the entire lesson. We begin our understanding with the concept of the governance and its meaning, the factors that contributed to that. The major factor that contributed to the concept of governance is state's inefficiency in implementing the public policies and the reduced scope for the dominance of the state. And one more important thing is that states' hierarchy has been questioned, and states needs to promote economic growth. State can no longer be a dominant actor. It means state needs to give scope for non-state actors by involving the private sector, market, business and civil society group in the decision making process. Governance is also a network at both formal level and informal level. Governance is about partnership. Governance is about steering these networks between the public-private partnership. India adopted these changes by reflecting its paradigm shift from government to governance. Starting from 8th five-year plan, we see an argument for a shift from government to governance, where from 11th five-year plan to 12th five-year plan, there has been a demand to increase the role of private sector in investments. India adopted public-private partnerships in both social sector and also in investment sector. And the results show that these public-private partnerships are varying from sector to sectors. There were the challenges in the implementation with regard to accountability, and there were questions about states' responsibility in delivering citizens. Among all these developments, the role of the state remains the same because it derives its legitimacy from the people, and it is the only one which can steer all these relationships. This is what all about paradigm shift from government to governance. For further details, you can look at the references. Thank you.